Hey everyone, so in today's video we're going to explore one of the most common ways that I initially try to expose the posterior scapulohumeral muscles to length and load, particularly when clients have a limitation in shoulder flexion, okay, or any overhead motion, where we think the source of that limitation is secondary to these scapulohumeral muscles not being able to tolerate that stretch or lengthening, okay? Now, it's important to consider within this video here that the intention behind the practical strategy that we go through next is to help the individual expand their shoulder flexion range of motion. It's not necessarily to build tolerance in those tissues to generate higher levels of force. So the force that we're generating through those tissues during the strategy in the second portion of this video isn't going to be high load. If we're trying to expose those muscular tissues to greater levels of force to try and encourage some kind of muscular or physical and neurological adaptation, then it would be slightly different. And we have covered some other strategies in recent videos as well, where we're still trying to get that load into those tissues, but we're not necessarily trying to do it in such a way to expand shoulder flexion range of motion. That's why on our courses we always discuss the difference between your goals of the intervention. Are you trying to improve range of motion, or are you trying to build greater muscular force generation? So of course, when a muscular tissue is stretching, is undergoing movement excursion as we move through a range of motion, we do still want it to be able to tolerate that stretch. And so we can still allow that muscular tissue to generate force as it moves through an excursion. So we're building that muscular tissue's tolerance to load as it undergoes a length change, okay? But we're not doing it in such a way to really generate higher levels of force. We're not necessarily trying to increase the strength potential of that muscular tissue. So that's one of the most important things to consider there. Secondly, when we're looking at shoulder flexion, yes, we do want a coupled motion between the scapula and the humerus, where they both contribute to the range of motion of shoulder flexion. It's not just the humerus that moves, it's not just the scapula that moves, it's the scapula and the humerus that move in a coordinated manner, okay? But sometimes the source of the limitation could be secondary to the scapula's inability to move relative to the ribcage. Other times it can be secondary to the humerus's inability to move secondary to the scapula. And in a previous video we've discussed some of the assessments that we can use to give us information as to what interaction may be the source of the limitation. Now, when I'm working with a client that comes to see me with a limitation and a pain experience with shoulder flexion, what I like to do is I like to try and utilize strategies that tick a lot of boxes simultaneously. Okay, so yes, I could use lots of different variations to constrain that demand into these tissues here, but am I doing it in a way that also works on gradually expanding that shoulder flexion range of motion? So oftentimes we don't really utilize strategies like that. So I'm going to show you the one that I use mostly in the second portion of this video. But what it requires is for us to organize the spine and the scapula in such a way where it reduces the contribution of that scapula to that overhead range of motion, okay? So what I want you to experience in your own body now is something like this. If I was to have both shoulders relatively level with each other and I bring both upper limbs through shoulder flexion, I'm going to get generally an equal range of motion through both sides, okay, unless you have a significant limitation on one side for whatever reason. But if I was to side bend my body, my spine in the direction to the right, for example, and then I try to flex my left shoulder, but if I keep that side bend to the right and I try to flex my right shoulder, I'm not going to go as far as the left. If I side bend to the left and I try to flex my left shoulder, I'm going to get a reduction in that range of motion, but I'm going to get an increase in the range of motion on the right side. This is why sometimes you'll see clients, when they raise their arm through flexion or scaption or abduction, is that you'll see them side bend away. And one of the reasons that I conceptually think about this to help me better understand why someone might do that is because when you side bend the spine away from the shoulder that's flexing, what that's going to do is it's going to encourage an upward rotation of the scapula and an elevation of the scapula. But it's not that the scapula is moving relative to the rib cage, it's the spine that is dragging the scapula into that direction, okay? So there's no real relative motion occurring between the scapula and the rib cage, but it is allowing us to change the position of the scapula, okay? So if, for example, we have a client that is limited with shoulder flexion and they have good scapular motion, so the source of the limitation is you're hypothesizing that it's these tissues between the humerus and the scapula that are struggling to tolerate stretch and experience load simultaneously, then what we would want to do is we would want to slightly side bend towards that side to try and limit the tendency of that scapula to move up to drag that humerus through a greater range of motion, okay? But the key thing here is that we want to get the client into a position where they're near their barrier and then side bend down so that the humerus maintains its relative position. But now, because we are side bending towards that side and we're maintaining the humerus in that position, now what we've done is we've brought the scapula into this almost depressed and downwardly rotated position. Humerus maintains the same position. So as I drive down via shoulder extension, but via the humerus, I'm really concentrating that demand into these tissues here. I'm not trying to drive through scapular retraction. I'm not trying to encourage load into these tissues. I'm trying to encourage load into the tissues that are undergoing most of the length change here, okay? And you should experience this in your own body as well. And of course, you can ask questions and let us know if you feel anything different, okay? But it is important to consider that clients will have their range of motion barriers at different levels, okay? So sometimes you actually may want to come short of that barrier by a couple of degrees, 10, 20 degrees, to build that confidence in that. If you bring them, let's say someone is limited at around this range of motion here, let's say 140, 50 degrees, and you bring them right up to that barrier and you have them side bend towards that side to try and drop the scapula down so that the length demand is on these tissues here that connect into the humerus, and you ask them to generate force via the upper limb into extension to try and get length and load into those tissues, then they may experience some sensitivity there because this is a position that they are currently restricted in, okay? And it depends on the sensitivity level of the client as well, depends on the other features of their pain experience as well, other subjective and objective features. So that's the key thing there, is that we're almost using the spine and the scapula moving as a single unit to make it easier for the client to reduce that contribution via the scapulothoracic joint so that we can keep that length demand via the scapulohumeral muscles, okay? Now, we're gonna, in the second portion of this video, we're going to use a dowel to allow for that to happen so that we can move the upper limb as we're doing that. So if you're doing this against a surface that doesn't really allow your fist to move, it can be quite difficult, because if I'm in this position here, for example, and I side bend, I do want that humerus to have the ability to drop down as well, but then as I go through the range of motion, I do want that humerus to have the ability to move as well at the same time, so that we're getting that relative motion between the humerus and the scapula. If I'm against an object that doesn't move, if my fist is against something that doesn't move, I can't really expand that range of motion as easily. And that's why having a dowel where we can actually move the contact point between the hand and the dowel here, it allows us to gradually expand that range of motion. Okay, so in the second portion of this video, we'll show you what this looks like. Okay, so like I said here, we're going to use a dowel as the implement to contact with our hand so that we can drive load via humeral extension or shoulder extension via the humerus. But just to kind of give you an idea of what my spine will be doing here as I'm facing the side, and I'll show you from behind as well. I'm essentially trying to shift my pelvis away. That will allow me to side bend my spine to the same side. And then when I'm in a position where I want to drive that load via shoulder extension, via the humerus, then I can squeeze the dowel and drive straight down through the dowel, and I should feel that load coming through the posterior scapulohumeral muscular tissues, in around posterior delts, wrapping around into the scapula as well. You may still also feel some load through the side of the rib cage as well, potentially into the lats, but it's more about how you're organizing things in such a way to encourage lengthening through a certain group of muscular tissues. And that's why we want to consider the interaction between segments, okay? So we're not necessarily trying to say that I'm trying to concentrate load into the teres major here or the posterior delta or whatever it might be. I'm ultimately trying to allow for two segments to move in opposing directions. I'm trying to limit the motion of the scapula to allow for the humerus to move through a greater excursion. But if, let's say this is the scapula, this is the humerus, and the humerus is kind of getting stuck here, then these muscular tissues that connect the scapula to the humerus may not be able to tolerate stretch. So like any other strategy we may utilize, we may have to just build that tolerance, but I need to reduce the contribution of the scapula, because then that's going to shorten those tissues. So I'm going to keep the scapula where it is. I'm going to try to move the humerus through a range, then load via humeral or shoulder extension via the humerus, but maintain that position and then gradually begin to push and expand that humerus as much as I can. The key thing to understand here as well, though, is that there will eventually need to be some scapular motion, because you're not going to be able to keep this scapula down and go through full range. You're just trying to keep that side bent and challenge the ability of the scapula to delay its upward rotation. Because if I'm here, for example, it's going to be much easier for the scapula to move. If I'm here, it's going to challenge that scapula's ability. It's almost going to slow down the ability of that scapula to get dragged up through upward rotation and elevation. Okay, so to show you from the side here, again, sometimes I'll do this in a tall kneeling position, sometimes a half kneeling position, sometimes in a standing position as well, if the client has a surface that they can use a dowel on. And again, you don't also have to use a dowel. There are other ways you can implement this as well. And we can go through some of those in upcoming videos. But let's say I'm using the right upper limb here. I'm in a half kneeling position with the same side knee in an extended position, okay? I'm going to grab the dowel. Now, another thing to consider here is that I don't want the dowel like this, for example. I want that the length of the dowel to be perpendicular to the humerus. So if I'm here and I'm trying to drive through shoulder extension, it's not going to really allow me to generate that force through the humerus as it moves into shoulder extension. I want it to be relatively perpendicular as I come through this range of motion here. Okay, so I think a nice place to start is just above 90 degrees for people initially, just to get them exposed to this, this experience of load through those tissues. So let's say here, I'm at around 90 degrees. What I can do is I can hinge forward, I can shift my pelvis away. That will allow me to drop the spine to a side bend to the right. And then all I'm doing then is I'm kind of hinging forward a bit more, maintain that position as I build pressure straight down into the ground via the dowel. So I'm obviously having the grip tight here, drive force down to the ground. I can manipulate how much intensity, I can manipulate the intensity of the contraction. Again, I'm keeping it very low though. I typically wouldn't go above a 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10. I'm keeping it around a 3 or 4 at the moment now, but I'm holding for longer durations and I feel that load coming right through here. Then what I can do as well is I can kind of shift that a bit further forward, hinge back a bit further, shift the pelvis to the side. That's going to drop me down here. I can hinge, the more I hinge back, the more that humerus, that shoulder is going through flexion. So if I hinge back, shift or translate the pelvis away, that'll drop me to the right. Keeping that position here, I try to keep my elbow facing the ground here as well, and I build pressure straight down. And you should feel that load coming through here. Okay, and of course I can change the position here. I can come back a bit further, I can side bend, hinge back even further, come through as I crush down as well, just to change how much range I'm bringing that humerus through. Okay, but the key thing is getting the individual into a position near their barrier. We may have to elevate the dowel up onto a surface as well, so we can bring that arm, the hand up through a greater position in space as well. But it's about getting the client exposed to those to load through those tissues as they undergo length. I just want to show you what that looks like from behind as well. So we're in this half kneeling position. I'm going to shift my pelvis away. You can see how that will induce a side bend towards the right. And then as I'm hinging, that's going to reduce the ability of the scapula to get dragged upwards as I build pressure down through the dowel. So I'm driving the dowel into the ground here now. So I'd encourage you to try this at home. Again, start just above 90 degrees, shift, side bend. And then the nice thing about this as well is that you can also protract. So when we get deeper into this as well, you can still allow for a protraction of the scapula here as you reduce the upward rotation. But here we want that scapula not to be pinned back into an externally rotated position, not to be fully protracted, but to be in a nice comfortable position where we're probably more so in that scapular plane, but we're still trying to get that dropping of the scapula as we hinge and then drive straight down. But you should start to feel that load coming through these tissues here, and you should be able to hold that for typically the dosage here. If I'm trying to encourage a client to expand that range of motion at home, I want them to do that at least 4 or 5 times across the day for at least 30 to 45 seconds at a low intensity. I don't want them to feel like they're feeling fatigued after each set. I want them to feel a kind of a moderate burning sensation through those tissues. But I want them to do that little and often throughout the day, maybe 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 2 in the evening. And I'll typically have them do that every day. When I'm trying to expand range of motion, I want the client to frequently expose themselves to load through those tissues that need to undergo a movement excursion, okay? But again, this might not be for every single client initially. It's one that I like to try at the very beginning because it allows us to integrate multiple features. The direction of motion that they're limited in. It allows us to get some load through the triceps as well. Because I'm keeping my elbow facing the ground, I'm bringing the triceps into the line of pull here so that I'm still getting some load through the biarticular tissues. I'm also still getting some load up through here as well. You can manipulate the humeral rotation as well to change how the upper limb is experiencing that load. So again, there's a lot of different features within this one exercise, but it's one that I like to use early on because if the client can tolerate this well, if they can feel that they're getting some load through that range of motion, then it checks a lot of boxes at home, and it means that I don't have to give them 2 or 3 individual exercises to facilitate motion through the areas I want to. That would still work towards improving shoulder flexion. If I can get them to do one exercise that checks a lot of boxes, that covers many bases, then I'm going to utilize that over one that splits it into 3 or 4 different individual exercises. Okay, so give that a try. Hopefully the thought process makes sense. Again, it's one of many options that we have. Like I said, give it a try. Let me know how it feels. And again, if you have any questions, please let us know below.